The night Eliza Hartford's horse stumbled into a hidden gopher hole and threw her 15 miles from the nearest town, she thought the desert cold would claim her before dawn broke across the Nevada territory. It was January of 1881, and the high desert plateau between Silver Springs and Carson City had become a frozen wasteland after sundown. Eliza lay in the dirt, her right ankle screaming with pain, watching her mare limp away into the darkness with her saddlebag still secured to its flanks. Everything she owned in this world was in those bags, including the deed to the boarding house her late aunt had left her in Carson City. She had been traveling alone, which her father would have called foolish, but her father had been dead for 3 years now, and Eliza had learned that sometimes a woman had no choice but to be foolish if she wanted to survive. The temperature dropped with every passing minute. Eliza tried to stand, but her ankle buckled beneath her weight, sending fresh waves of agony through her leg. She fell back to the ground, her breath coming in short gasps that created small clouds in the freezing air. She was wearing a traveling dress, a wool coat, and a shawl, but none of it was enough against the brutal cold that swept across the open land. She could see her breath, could feel the chill seeping through her clothes and into her bones. She had perhaps 2 hours before hypothermia set in. Maybe less. Eliza pulled her coat tighter around herself and tried to think clearly through the pain and fear. She was on the main road between the 2 towns, which meant someone might come along eventually. But eventually might be tomorrow morning, and by then she would be a frozen corpse beside the road. She had matches in her coat pocket, but there was nothing out here to burn except sagebrush, and even if she could gather enough of it with her injured ankle, the wind would scatter any fire she managed to light. The stars overhead were brilliant and cold, offering no comfort. Eliza had never felt so alone in her entire life. Then she heard hoofbeats. At first, she thought she might be imagining them, that her mind was already playing tricks on her as the cold worked its way deeper into her body. But the sound grew louder, more distinct, and she forced herself to call out even though her voice came out weak and thin. "Help, please, someone help me," the hoofbeats slowed, then stopped. Eliza heard boots hitting the ground, and then a figure appeared above her, silhouetted against the starlight. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. "Ma'am," his voice was deep and cautious. "What happened here?" "My horse threw me," Eliza managed to say through chattering teeth. "My ankle is injured. I cannot walk." The man knelt beside her, and in the starlight, Eliza could make out more of his features. He had a strong jaw, dark hair that fell past his collar, and eyes that reflected genuine concern. He looked to be perhaps 26 or 27 years old, weathered by sun and wind in the way of men who spent their lives outdoors. "How long have you been out here?" he asked, already shrugging out of his heavy coat. "Maybe an hour," Eliza said. "Please, you do not need to." But he was already draping the coat over her shoulders. It was warm from his body heat and smelled like leather and wood smoke and something else she could not quite identify. Beneath the coat, he wore a wool shirt and a vest, but that would not be nearly enough against this cold. "You will freeze," Eliza protested, even as she pulled the coat tighter around herself. "I will survive better than you will," he said simply. He moved to his horse and returned with a thick blanket that had been rolled behind his saddle. "But I have got this too." He wrapped the blanket around her over the coat, tucking it carefully around her legs and feet. The blanket was heavy and warm, lined with what felt like rabbit fur. Eliza felt tears spring to her eyes, though whether from relief or gratitude or simply the pain in her ankle she could not say. "Thank you," she whispered. "Can you ride?" he asked, studying her face in the darkness. "I think so if you help me mount." He nodded and went back to his horse, a large bay gelding that stood patiently in the cold. When he returned, he bent down and carefully lifted Eliza into his arms. She gasped at the sudden movement, pain shooting through her ankle, but he held her steady. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I know it hurts." He carried her to the horse and lifted her into the saddle with surprising gentleness for such a large man. Eliza gripped the saddle horn, dizzy with pain and cold. The cowboy mounted behind her, one arm coming around her waist to hold her steady while his other hand took the reins. "I am taking you to my ranch," he said. "It is about 3 miles north of here, closer than either town, and you need to get warm and have that ankle looked at." Eliza knew she should probably protest, should insist on being taken to Carson City where she had respectable lodging waiting for her. But she was so cold, and his arm around her waist was warm and solid, and she could not quite bring herself to argue. "What is your name?" she asked as the horse began to move at a steady walk. "James Carver," he said. "I run a cattle ranch north of here with my brother, Eliza Hartford. I am traveling to Carson City." "Long way to travel alone," James observed, though his tone held no judgment. "I inherited a boarding house there from my aunt. I am coming from San Francisco to take possession of it." They rode in silence for a while, the horse's hoofbeats steady and rhythmic. Eliza leaned back against James's chest without quite meaning to, drawn by the warmth of his body and the exhaustion that was rapidly overtaking her. She felt his arm tighten slightly around her waist, holding her more securely. "How did you end up out here tonight?" Eliza asked, needing to stay awake and alert despite her body's desire to simply surrender to the warmth and safety she felt in his arms. "I was in Silver Springs picking up supplies," James said. "Should have stayed the night there, but I wanted to get home. My brother worries when I am gone too long." "Is he younger than you?" "Older by 2 years, but he has a leg that did not heal right after a fall from a horse 5 years back. Makes him unable to do some of the harder ranch work, so I handle most of it. He manages the business side of things, keeps the books, deals with the buyers." Eliza could hear the affection in James's voice when he spoke of his brother, and it warmed her almost as much as the blanket did. She had always wanted siblings, but had been an only child, left alone in the world after her parents' deaths. The ranch house appeared out of the darkness like a blessing. It was a solid structure built of timber and stone, with lamplight glowing in the windows. Smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth inside. There was a barn nearby and several outbuildings, all well-maintained despite the harsh environment. James dismounted and carefully lifted Eliza down from the saddle. She bit her lip to keep from crying out as the movement jostled her ankle. He carried her toward the house, kicking the door gently with his boot. "Thomas, open up." The door swung open to reveal a man who looked very much like James, though his hair was lighter and his face slightly thinner. He had a cane in one hand and concern written all over his features. "What happened?" Thomas asked, stepping back to let them in, found her on the road. "Horse threw her and she injured her ankle. She was freezing to death out there." Thomas closed the door quickly behind them, shutting out the brutal cold. The inside of the house was blessedly warm, heat radiating from a stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the main room. James carried Eliza to a sofa near the fire and set her down gently, propping her injured leg on a cushion. "I will get some water heating," Thomas said, already moving toward the kitchen area. "And I will find something she can wear while her clothes dry. She is shaking hard enough to rattle teeth." Only then did Eliza realize she was indeed shaking, violent tremors running through her body as it tried to warm itself. James knelt beside the sofa and carefully began unwrapping the blanket and his coat from around her. "We need to get you out of these wet clothes," he said, his voice matter-of-fact and professional. "Your dress is damp with sweat from the ride, and that will make you colder. My brother will find you something dry to wear." Eliza nodded, too exhausted and cold to protest the impropriety of the situation. Thomas returned with an armload of clothing and a basin of water. "These were our mother's," Thomas said, setting the clothes on a chair near the sofa. "She passed 2 years ago, but we kept her things. Should fit you well enough." "I will be in the barn seeing to the horse," James said, rising to his feet. "Thomas will help you change and look at that ankle." He left the house without another word, and Eliza found herself oddly bereft at his absence. Thomas helped her out of her damp dress and into a soft flannel nightgown and a thick wool robe. He was gentle and respectful, keeping his eyes averted as much as possible while still providing necessary assistance. "Now let me see that ankle," Thomas said once Eliza was dressed and covered with blankets on the sofa. He examined her foot carefully, his fingers probing gently. Eliza winced but stayed still. "Not broken," Thomas pronounced. "Badly sprained, though. You will need to stay off it for at least a week, maybe 2. "But I need to get to Carson City," Eliza protested. "The boarding house will still be there in 2 weeks," Thomas interrupted gently. "You try to travel on this ankle before it heals and you will do permanent damage. Besides, the worst of the winter storms are supposed to come through this week. You are safer here than trying to make it to Carson City." Eliza wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. Her ankle throbbed with a deep, persistent ache that suggested Thomas was being optimistic about the 2-week timeline. She leaned back against the sofa cushions and closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the fire finally beginning to penetrate the deep cold that had settled into her bones. James returned a few minutes later, stamping his boots at the door to shake off the cold. "Horse is settled," he reported. "Fed and watered and in a warm stall." "Thank you," Eliza said, "for everything. I would have died out there if you had not come along." James shrugged uncomfortably. "Anyone would have done the same. But you were the one who did it," Eliza insisted. "That blanket you gave me, it saved my life." James met her eyes then, and Eliza felt something shift in the air between them. His gaze was intense and searching, as though he was trying to read something in her face that she herself did not yet understand. "I am glad I decided to ride home tonight instead of staying in town," he said quietly. Thomas cleared his throat. "I will make some coffee and heat up the stew from dinner. You both need something warm in you." Over the next hour, Eliza learned more about the Carver brothers and their ranch. They ran about 300 head of cattle on 2,000 acres of high desert land. Their father had started the ranch 30 years ago, back when Nevada was still a territory, and had built it into a successful operation before dying of a heart attack 7 years earlier. Their mother had passed more recently, as Thomas had mentioned, from pneumonia. "It is just the 2 of us now," James said, cradling a tin cup of coffee in his large hands. "We have a few ranch hands who help during calving season and roundup, but mostly we manage on our own." "It must be hard work," Eliza observed. "Hard but honest," James said. "I could not imagine doing anything else." Eliza found herself drawn to the quiet pride in his voice, the way his face softened when he talked about the ranch. She had spent most of her adult life in San Francisco, working as a seamstress to support herself after her parents died. It had been a hard, lonely existence, punctuated by the constant struggle to pay rent and buy food. The boarding house her aunt had left her represented a chance at a better life, a way to finally have security and independence. But sitting here in this warm ranch house, watching James Carver's face in the firelight, Eliza felt something she had not felt in years. A sense of belonging, of being exactly where she was meant to be. She told herself she was being ridiculous. She had known this man for barely 2 hours. She was injured and vulnerable, and he had helped her. That was all. The strange warmth spreading through her chest had nothing to do with the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, or the gentleness of his hands when he had carried her, or the fact that he had given her his coat and blanket without a moment's hesitation, even though it meant he would suffer the cold himself. Thomas announced he was going to bed, leaving Eliza and James alone in the main room with only the crackling fire for company. James added another log to the flames and settled into a chair near the sofa. "You should sleep," he said. "It has been a difficult night for you." "I do not think I can sleep yet," Eliza admitted. "My mind is still racing, I suppose, the shock of everything." James nodded in understanding. "Would you like me to sit with you for a while?" "I would like that very much." They talked long into the night, their voices low and intimate in the firelight. Eliza told James about her life in San Francisco, about the loneliness of the city and the constant struggle to survive. She told him about her parents, who had died within months of each other when she was 19, leaving her alone in a world that had little mercy for young women without family or fortune. James listened with an attentiveness that made Eliza feel truly heard for perhaps the first time in her life. When it was his turn to talk, he told her about growing up on the ranch, about the freedom of the open land and the satisfaction of building something with his own hands. He told her about his brother's accident and the guilt he still carried over it, even though Thomas insisted it was not his fault. "I was supposed to check the fencing in the north pasture that day," James said quietly. "But I was tired and asked Thomas to do it instead. The horse spooked at something, maybe a rattlesnake, and threw him hard. He landed on his leg wrong and it shattered in 3 places. The doctor in Silver Springs did his best, but it never healed quite right." "You cannot blame yourself for that," Eliza said firmly. "Accidents happen. Your brother could just as easily have been thrown from a horse checking any other part of the ranch." "I know that in my head," James admitted. "But my heart has a harder time believing it." Eliza reached out without thinking and placed her hand over his. His fingers were warm and calloused from years of hard work. He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face, and Eliza saw something kindle in his dark eyes that made her breath catch. "You should rest," James said again, but his voice was rougher now, touched with an emotion Eliza did not dare name. "Will you stay?" Eliza asked softly. "Just until I fall asleep. I will stay as long as you need me to." Eliza settled back into the cushions, her hand still in his, and let her eyes drift closed. She fell asleep to the sound of the fire crackling and the steady rhythm of James's breathing, feeling safer and more at peace than she had in years. When she woke the next morning, pale winter sunlight was streaming through the windows, and James was asleep in the chair beside her, his head tilted back and his hand still holding hers. Eliza lay still for a long moment, studying his face in the morning light. He had strong, honest features, the kind of face that could never hide what he was feeling. There was a small scar on his chin and laugh lines around his eyes despite his relative youth. His dark hair fell across his forehead, and Eliza had to resist the urge to reach up and brush it back. What was happening to her? She had been raised to be practical, to understand that love was something that came after marriage if it came at all. Love was not something that struck like lightning on a cold desert night. Love was not something you felt for a man you had just met, no matter how kind he had been or how safe you felt in his presence. But as Eliza lay there watching James sleep, she could not deny the truth that was already taking root in her heart. She was falling in love with him, and there was nothing practical or sensible about it whatsoever. James stirred and opened his eyes, taking a moment to orient himself. When he saw Eliza watching him, a slow smile spread across his face. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning. You did not have to sleep in that chair all night. I wanted to make sure you were all right." He sat up straighter, rolling his shoulders to work out the stiffness. "How is your ankle?" "Still painful, but better than last night." Thomas appeared from one of the back rooms, fully dressed and leaning on his cane. "I will make breakfast," he announced. "James, you should probably wash up and change your shirt. You look like you slept in your clothes." "I did sleep in my clothes," James pointed out, but he stood and headed toward the back of the house. Thomas busied himself in the kitchen area, and soon the smell of frying bacon and coffee filled the house. Eliza felt awkward sitting idle while he worked, but when she tried to stand, her ankle gave a throb of protest that made her sit back down quickly. "None of that," Thomas said without turning around. "You are our guest and you are injured. Let yourself be taken care of for once." Over breakfast, the brothers discussed the day's work. There were cattle to check on, fences to inspect, and with the storms coming in, they needed to make sure everything was secure. James volunteered to handle most of the outdoor work while Thomas focused on the bookkeeping that had piled up over the past week. "What about Miss Hartford?" Thomas asked, glancing at Eliza. "I will be fine on my own," Eliza said quickly. "You both have work to do." "I will just sit here by the fire and rest my ankle." "There are books on the shelf there if you want something to read," James offered. "And if you need anything, just call out. Thomas will be working at the desk in the next room." After breakfast, James dressed in his heavy coat and headed out into the cold. Eliza watched through the window as he strode toward the barn, his breath creating clouds in the frigid air. The sky was overcast, heavy with the promise of snow. Thomas settled at a large desk in the adjacent room, and Eliza could hear the scratch of his pen as he worked through ledgers and accounts. She found a book on the shelf, a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets that must have belonged to their mother, and tried to read. But her eyes kept drifting to the window, watching for glimpses of James as he went about his work. Around midday, fat snowflakes began to fall. Within an hour, the snow was coming down heavily, transforming the landscape into a white wilderness. Eliza could barely make out the barn through the curtain of falling snow. She began to worry about James, out there alone in the storm. But when he finally came stamping through the door several hours later, he was grinning despite being covered in snow from head to toe. "Everything is secured," he reported. "The cattle have shelter and plenty of hay. We are ready for whatever the storm brings." He shook off his coat and hung it by the door, then came to stand by the fire, holding his hands out to the warmth. Eliza noticed his fingers were red with cold. "You should have worn gloves," she scolded gently. "I was wearing gloves. It is just that cold out there." Thomas made hot coffee, and they all sat around the fire as the storm raged outside. The wind howled around the corners of the house, and the snow piled up against the windows. Inside, though, it was warm and cozy, the fire crackling cheerfully and the lamplight casting soft shadows on the walls. "Looks like you will be stuck with us for a few days," Thomas observed, peering out at the storm. "That snow is not going to let up any time soon, and the roads will be impassable for at least a day or two after it does." "I hope I am not too much of an imposition," Eliza said, though in truth, the thought of being stranded here with the Carver brothers did not distress her at all. "Nonsense," James said firmly. "You are welcome here for as long as you need to stay." Over the next 3 days, the storm continued its assault on the high desert. Snow piled up in drifts that reached the windows, and the wind howled like a living thing trying to force its way inside. But the ranch house held firm, and inside its walls, something new and precious was growing between Eliza and James. They fell into an easy routine. James would do the necessary outdoor work in the morning, checking on the animals and making sure everything remained secure. Then he would come in half-frozen, and Eliza would have hot coffee waiting for him. They would sit by the fire and talk, their conversations ranging from the profound to the mundane. Thomas often joined them, and Eliza enjoyed his dry wit and the obvious love between the two brothers. But it was the evenings she cherished most, when Thomas would retire early and leave her alone with James. They would sit close together on the sofa, ostensibly because it was the warmest spot by the fire, but Eliza knew there was more to it than that. She was drawn to James like a moth to flame, and she could see in his eyes that he felt the same pull toward her. On the third night of the storm, as they sat together watching the flames dance in the fireplace, James reached over and took her hand in his. "Eliza," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." Her heart began to pound. "What is it?" "I know we have only known each other a few days. I know that by all rights I should not be feeling what I am feeling, but I cannot deny it any longer." He turned to face her fully, his dark eyes intense and honest. "From the moment I found you on that road, something inside me shifted. It was like I had been waiting my whole life for that moment without even knowing it. And these past few days, getting to know you, talking with you, just being near you," he broke off, shaking his head. I am not good with fancy words, but what I am trying to say is that I am falling in love with you, Eliza Hartford. I think I started falling the moment I wrapped that blanket around you and saw your face in the starlight. Eliza felt tears spring to her eyes. Oh, James, I have been feeling the same thing and trying so hard to tell myself it was impossible. That love did not work this way, that you could not fall for someone so quickly. But you did fall, James asked, his voice almost hesitant as though he could not quite believe what he was hearing. I fell hard, Eliza admitted. You gave me warmth when I was freezing to death, James. But that was not the only warmth you gave me. You gave me something I have not felt in so long I had almost forgotten what it was like. You gave me hope. You gave me a sense of belonging. You gave me the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I had finally found the place where I was meant to be. James cupped her face in his hands, his touch infinitely gentle. You are meant to be here with me. I know that as surely as I know my own name. He kissed her then, soft and sweet, and Eliza felt the last of her resistance crumble. She kissed him back, pouring all her newfound love into that kiss, all her hope and joy and wonder at having found this man against all odds. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless. James rested his forehead against hers, his hands still cradling her face. Stay, he whispered. Do not go to Carson City. Stay here with me. Marry me, Eliza. I know it is fast, I know it is crazy, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. Yes, Eliza breathed. Yes, I will marry you. They kissed again, longer this time, deeper, until the fire had burned down to embers, and the storm outside seemed to quiet in respect for the moment happening within the walls of the ranch house. The next morning, Eliza woke on the sofa to find James had covered her with the same blanket he had given her that first night. He was already up and moving around the house, and when he saw she was awake, he brought her coffee and sat beside her. Did you mean what you said last night? He asked, as though he needed confirmation that it had not all been a dream. Every word, Eliza assured him. Did you? Every word. You are going to be my wife, Eliza Hartford, as soon as we can arrange it. Thomas emerged from his room and took in the scene before him with knowing eyes. So you two finally admitted what has been obvious to everyone with eyes, did you? We are getting married, James announced, unable to keep the grin off his face. About time, Thomas said mildly. I was beginning to think I would have to lock you in a room together until you figured it out. Congratulations to you both. The storm finally broke the next day, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. The sun came out bright and brilliant, turning the white landscape into a dazzling display of light. James bundled Eliza up in warm clothes, more of his mother's things that Thomas had found, and carried her outside so she could see the beauty of the ranch in winter. The snow came up to his knees in places, but James waded through it without complaint, holding Eliza securely in his arms. She looked out over the white expanse of land, the cattle clustered near the barn where James had set out hay for them, the mountains in the distance sharp and clear against the blue sky. It is beautiful, she breathed. It is home, James said. You're home now if you want it. I want it, Eliza said firmly. I want this land and this house and you and your brother and all of it. I want the life we can build here together. What about the boarding house in Carson City? Eliza had been thinking about that. I can sell it or hire someone to manage it for me. The income from it would help the ranch, would it not? Extra money for lean years, for improvements, for expanding the herd. James looked down at her with such love in his eyes that Eliza felt her breath catch. You have been thinking about this practically, planning for a future here. I have been thinking about little else, Eliza admitted. I want to be your wife, James. I want to build a life with you. Whatever that takes, I am willing to do it. They went back inside before Eliza could get too cold, and over the next few days, as the snow began to melt and the roads slowly became passable again, they made plans for their future. Eliza's ankle was healing well, and she was able to put some weight on it now, though Thomas cautioned her not to push too hard too fast. James rode to Silver Springs as soon as the roads were clear enough and sent telegrams to Carson City, inquiring about hiring a manager for the boarding house. He also stopped by the small church in town and spoke to the minister about performing a wedding ceremony. When he returned to the ranch that evening, he swept Eliza into his arms and spun her around despite her protests about her ankle. "The minister says he can marry us in 2 weeks," James announced. "Is that too soon?" "It is not soon enough," Eliza laughed, "but 2 weeks will give me time to recover properly and to make a dress. You can sew? I was a seamstress in San Francisco, remember? I can make myself a wedding dress, assuming your mother's sewing supplies are still around." Thomas produced a trunk full of fabric and thread and needles, and Eliza set to work. Her ankle was strong enough now that she could sit at the table and work on the dress for hours at a time. She chose a simple pattern in ivory wool, practical and warm for a winter wedding on a Nevada ranch. She trimmed it with lace she found in the trunk and embroidered tiny flowers along the neckline and cuffs. James watched her work with open admiration. "You are talented," he said one evening as he studied the partially completed dress. "I am practical," Eliza corrected. "A woman alone in the world needs skills she can sell. But I admit, I always found a certain satisfaction in taking something as simple as fabric and thread and turning it into something beautiful." "You could make dresses for other women around here," James suggested. "The ranchers' wives do not get to Silver Springs or Carson City often, and when they do, the selection is limited. I bet you could build a nice business for yourself if you wanted." The idea appealed to Eliza. She liked the thought of contributing to their household not just with the boarding house income but with her own skills and labor. "I would like that," she said. "Once we are settled, I will put the word out that I am taking orders." The 2 weeks passed quickly, filled with preparations for the wedding and for Eliza's permanent move into the ranch house. James and Thomas cleared out the spare room for her to use as a sewing room, and James built her a large work table with his own hands. Eliza was touched by the gesture, by the way he was making space for her and her work in his home without her even having to ask. Responses came back from Carson City about the boarding house. Several people were interested in managing it for a percentage of the profits. And after reviewing the offers, Eliza chose a widow named Mrs. Chen who had excellent references and experience running similar establishments. The arrangement would provide Eliza with a steady income while allowing her to focus on her new life on the ranch. The day of the wedding dawned clear and cold. Eliza dressed in her new gown, and Thomas helped arrange her hair, proving surprisingly adept at the task. "Our mother taught me," he explained when Eliza expressed surprise. "She said a man should know how to do practical things, even if they were traditionally considered women's work." "She sounds like she was a wise woman." She was. She would have loved you, Eliza." She always hoped James would find someone who could match his heart, someone strong enough to be a true partner to him. "I hope I can live up to that." "You already do," Thomas assured her. They traveled to Silver Springs in the wagon, with Thomas driving and James riding alongside. Despite the cold, several other ranching families from the area had come to the small church to witness the ceremony. Word had spread quickly about James Carver's sudden engagement, and people were curious to meet the woman who had captured his heart. Eliza felt nervous as she walked up the aisle on Thomas's arm, her ankle only slightly tender now after 2 weeks of healing. But when she saw James waiting for her at the altar, looking handsome and solid and utterly devoted in his best suit, her nerves vanished. This was right. This was exactly where she was supposed to be. The minister performed a simple ceremony, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed Eliza with such tenderness and joy that several of the watching women sighed audibly. There was a small reception afterward in the church's meeting hall, with food provided by the neighboring ranchers' wives and dancing to music played on a slightly out-of-tune piano. Eliza met many of their neighbors that day, and she was welcomed warmly into the community. The ranchers' wives were particularly interested when they learned she was a seamstress, and several immediately began discussing what kind of dresses they might like made. "You are going to be busy," James murmured in her ear as they danced together. "I may have created a monster when I suggested you offer your services." "A profitable monster," Eliza replied with a smile, "and I will make time for you, husband. Never doubt that." The word husband sent a thrill through James that Eliza could see plainly on his face. He pulled her closer, propriety be damned, and kissed her forehead. "Let us go home," he said softly. "I want to start our married life." They said their goodbyes and climbed into the wagon with Thomas. The ride back to the ranch was cold but beautiful, the setting sun painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Eliza sat close to James on the wagon seat, his arm around her shoulders, and marveled at how much her life had changed in such a short time. 3 weeks ago, she had been alone and struggling in San Francisco, preparing for a solitary journey to take possession of a boarding house she had never seen. Now she was married to a man she loved beyond measure, on her way to a home that felt more right than anywhere she had ever lived. When they reached the ranch, Thomas excused himself to his room with a knowing smile, leaving James and Eliza alone in the main room with the fire crackling cheerfully. "I still cannot quite believe this is real," Eliza said, turning to face her new husband. "That I found you, that you found me. That we are actually married. It is real," James assured her. He took both her hands in his. "You are my wife, Eliza Carver, and I promise you I will spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you never regret saying yes to me." "I could never regret it. You saved my life, James. And then you gave me a reason to live it." He kissed her then, deep and passionate, and Eliza felt desire kindle low in her belly. She had been married before, briefly, at 19, to a man who had died of typhoid fever 6 months after their wedding. But that marriage had been one of convenience, arranged by her dying father to ensure she would be taken care of. There had been affection but not love, obligation but not passion. This was different. This was what she had always dreamed marriage could be but had stopped believing was possible. James lifted her into his arms and carried her to his bedroom, which would now be their bedroom. He set her down gently on the bed and began unlacing her dress with trembling fingers. "I want to make you happy," he said quietly. "In every way, tell me if I do something you do not like." "I will," Eliza promised. "And James, I want to make you happy too. Tell me what you need, what you want." "I want you," James said simply. "Just you. That is all I have ever wanted since that first night." They came together with a tenderness that brought tears to Eliza's eyes. James was gentle and attentive, taking his time to learn what made her gasp with pleasure, what made her arch against him. Eliza responded with equal passion, marveling at the connection she felt with him, the sense that they were two halves finally made whole. Afterwards, they lay tangled together under the quilts, Eliza's head resting on James's chest as he played with her hair. "I love you," James said into the darkness. "I know I already told you before, but I want to keep telling you for the rest of our lives." "I love you too," Eliza replied. "So much it frightens me sometimes. I have lost everyone I ever loved before. I could not bear it if I lost you." "You are not going to lose me," James said firmly. "I am young and healthy and careful about my work. We are going to have a long, happy life together, Eliza. I can feel it." Eliza wanted to believe him, but she knew life in the West was unpredictable and often harsh. Accidents happened. Illness struck without warning. But she pushed those dark thoughts away and focused instead on the warmth of James's body beside her, the steady beat of his heart under her ear, the security of his arms around her. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and Eliza dreamed of the future they would build together. The winter passed slowly but contentedly. Eliza settled into life on the ranch with surprising ease. She had expected it to be difficult, adjusting to the isolation and the hard work, but instead she found peace in the rhythms of ranch life. She learned to bake bread in the temperamental wood stove, to preserve vegetables and fruits for the winter, to mend clothes and make soap and do the 1,000 other tasks that kept a household running. She also established her dressmaking business, and within a month, she had more orders than she could easily handle. The ranchers' wives were thrilled to have someone nearby who could create fashionable, well-made dresses without the need for an expensive and time-consuming trip to Carson City. Eliza worked on the dresses in her sewing room whenever she had free time, and the income proved substantial enough to make a real difference to the ranch's finances. James was endlessly proud of her, bragging to anyone who would listen about his talented wife. Eliza would blush and scold him for embarrassing her, but secretly she was pleased by his obvious admiration and support. Thomas, too, proved to be an easy companion. His dry sense of humor and quiet kindness made him feel less like a brother-in-law and more like the sibling Eliza had always wished for. The three of them worked together to keep the ranch running smoothly through the harsh winter months. In March, as the snow began to melt and the first hints of spring appeared, Eliza realized she had missed her monthly courses. She waited another week to be sure, then told James one evening as they were preparing for bed. "I think I am pregnant," she said, watching his face carefully for his reaction. James froze in the act of removing his shirt, his eyes going wide. "Pregnant? Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor." "My courses are 6 weeks late, and I have been feeling queasy in the mornings." James crossed the room in 2 strides and swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. "We are going to have a baby." He shouted loud enough that Thomas could undoubtedly hear him in the next room. "Eliza, this is wonderful. So you are happy about it?" Eliza asked, laughing at his exuberance. "Happy? I am overjoyed. This is the best news you could possibly have given me." He set her down carefully, as though she were suddenly made of fragile glass, and placed his hand over her still flat stomach. "Our child," he said wonderingly, "growing right here." "It will be months before there is anything to see or feel," Eliza pointed out, amused by his awe. "I do not care. I know they are in there, and that is enough." Thomas congratulated them the next morning at breakfast, his eyes suspiciously bright. "I am going to be an uncle," he said. "Our parents would have been so happy to know their legacy was continuing. Will you be the baby's godfather?" Eliza asked impulsively. "I cannot think of anyone I would trust more." Thomas cleared his throat gruffly. "I would be honored." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and into the summer. Eliza's belly swelled as the desert bloomed with wildflowers, and the cattle grew fat on fresh grass. She had to stop taking dressmaking orders in her 7th month, much to the disappointment of her customers, but she promised to resume after the baby was born and she had recovered. James was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly worrying that Eliza was doing too much or pushing herself too hard. She tolerated his fussing with good humor, understanding that it came from love and the fear of losing her or the baby. In August, when the heat shimmered over the desert and the days stretched long and bright, Eliza went into labor. The local midwife, Mrs. Patterson, had moved into the ranch house 3 days earlier to be ready when the time came. She shooed James and Thomas out of the bedroom and got to work. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next morning. James paced the main room like a caged animal, driving Thomas to distraction with his constant movement and worried questions. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time," Thomas finally said, exasperated. "Eliza is strong and healthy. She will be fine." But James could not be reassured until he heard the thin, reedy wail of a newborn baby coming from the bedroom. He rushed to the door, but Mrs. Patterson blocked his way. "Give us a few minutes to clean up," she said firmly. "Then you can come in and meet your son." "A son," James repeated, his voice breaking on the word. "I have a son, you do indeed, a healthy boy with a good set of lungs on him." When James was finally allowed into the bedroom, he found Eliza propped up against the pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. The baby had a shock of dark hair and a red, scrunched-up face that James thought was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Meet your son," Eliza said softly, holding the baby out to James. James took the infant carefully, cradling him against his chest. The baby opened his eyes and seemed to stare directly at his father, and James felt his heart expand with a love so fierce and protective it almost hurt. "Hello there, little one," James whispered. "I am your father, and I am going to love you and protect you for as long as I live." "What should we name him?" Eliza asked. They had discussed names but never settled on anything definite. James looked down at his son, at Eliza lying tired but happy in the bed, and knew exactly what the baby's name should be. "Matthew," he said, "after my father. Matthew Thomas Carver, if that is all right with you." "Matthew Thomas," Eliza repeated, testing the sound of it. "I like it. And I think your father and Thomas would both be honored." Thomas was allowed in shortly after, and he held his nephew with surprising confidence for a man who had never held a baby before. "Welcome to the world, Matthew Thomas," he said solemnly. "You have got yourself a good family here." Life with a baby proved both more challenging and more rewarding than Eliza had anticipated. Matthew was a healthy, hungry child who demanded attention at all hours of the day and night. Eliza was exhausted much of the time, but whenever she looked at her son or saw James holding him with such obvious love and wonder, she felt a contentment so deep it bordered on bliss. James was a devoted father from the start. He would wake with Eliza during the night feedings, bringing her water and talking to her softly to keep her awake. He changed diapers without complaint and walked the floor with Matthew when the baby was fussy, singing old ranch songs in his deep voice until the infant settled. As Matthew grew from newborn to infant to toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. The cattle herd expanded, and they were able to hire 2 full-time ranch hands to help with the work. Eliza resumed her dressmaking business once Matthew was old enough that she could work while he played nearby, and her reputation spread to surrounding towns. The boarding house in Carson City continued to provide steady income under Mrs. Chen's capable management. Eliza and James visited it once, when Matthew was a year old, and Eliza was pleased to see how well the widow was running the establishment. She made a point of visiting every few months after that, bringing Matthew along and using the trips as opportunities to purchase fabric and supplies for her dressmaking. When Matthew was 3 years old, Eliza discovered she was pregnant again. This time James was calmer about the news, though no less thrilled. "Another baby," he said, pulling Eliza into his arms. "Our family is growing. Are you hoping for a boy or a girl this time?" Eliza asked. "I do not care either way. I just want a healthy baby and a healthy wife." In early spring of 1885, Eliza gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Catherine. Where Matthew had been a fussy, demanding baby, Sarah was serene and content, sleeping through the night at just 6 weeks old and rarely crying. She had Eliza's lighter hair and James's dark eyes, and her father was completely smitten with her from the first moment. "I have a daughter," James said wonderingly, holding Sarah's tiny hand with one of his fingers. "A little girl who is going to be as beautiful and strong as her mother." Thomas doted on both children, teaching Matthew to ride and helping Eliza care for Sarah when James was out on the range. The ranch house rang with laughter and the sounds of children playing, transforming it from a simple dwelling into a true home filled with love. When Sarah was 2 and Matthew was 5, they took a family trip to Carson City to visit the boarding house and do some shopping. While there, they ran into the minister who had married James and Eliza 5 years earlier. "Reverend Thompson," Eliza exclaimed, "how wonderful to see you, Mrs. Carver." "Mr. Carver," the minister greeted them warmly. "And these must be your children. My, how you have been blessed." "We have indeed," James agreed, his arm around Eliza's shoulders and his eyes on their 2 children who were playing nearby under Thomas's watchful gaze. "I remember your wedding well," Reverend Thompson said. "It was one of the shortest engagements I had ever seen, but also one of the truest loves. I could see it in both your faces. You were meant for each other." "We were," Eliza said, smiling up at James. though neither of us knew it until the night we met. God works in mysterious ways, the minister said. If your horse had not thrown you, if Mr. Carver had decided to stay in Silver Springs that night instead of riding home, you never would have met. But Providence brought you together. Providence and a warm blanket, James said with a grin. After the minister moved on, Eliza stood in the busy street of Carson City and thought about that cold night nearly 6 years ago. She thought about lying injured and freezing on the side of the road, certain she was going to die. She thought about the sound of hoofbeats and James's deep voice asking what had happened. She thought about the warmth of his coat and the blanket he had wrapped around her and the way she had felt when he lifted her onto his horse and held her safe. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, seeing the distant look in her eyes. "That night," Eliza said, "when you found me. I was so cold, James, not just physically but in my soul. I had been cold for years, ever since my parents died, going through the motions of life but never really feeling warm or safe or loved. And then you gave me that blanket and you took me home and you did not just warm my body. You warmed my entire life." James pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You did the same for me. I did not even realize how empty my life was until you filled it. You gave me a warmth I did not know I was missing, Eliza. You gave me love and family and joy. You gave me everything." They stood there on the busy street, holding each other while people streamed past them, lost in their own world. Matthew ran up and tugged on James's coat. "Papa, Uncle Thomas says we can get candy from the general store. Can we? Please?" James laughed and scooped his son up onto his shoulders. "We can. Come on, let us go find your sister and get some candy." They walked through Carson City as a family, James carrying Matthew on his shoulders, Eliza holding Sarah's small hand, Thomas walking beside them with his cane. They looked, Eliza thought, like exactly what they were: a happy, prosperous family blessed with love and good fortune. That night, back at the ranch after the long trip home, Eliza stood at the window of their bedroom and looked out over the moonlit landscape. The desert was beautiful in the silver light, peaceful and vast. James came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on top of her head. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. "More than I ever thought possible," Eliza replied honestly. "There were times before I met you when I wondered if I would ever feel truly happy again. If I would ever have a real home or a family of my own, and now I have all of that and more." "We built something good here," James said. "You and me and Thomas and the kids, something worth protecting and nurturing." "We did," Eliza agreed, "and we will keep building it day by day, year by year." She turned in his arms and kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into that kiss. When they finally pulled apart, James smiled down at her with such tenderness it made her heart ache in the best possible way. "I love you, Eliza Carver. I will love you until the day I die and probably beyond that. I love you too, James. Thank you for finding me that night. Thank you for saving me." "You saved me right back," James said. "We saved each other." The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Matthew grew into a serious, responsible boy who loved the ranch and the cattle as much as his father did. Sarah was bright and curious, always asking questions and demanding to know how things worked. When she was 8 years old, she announced that she wanted to learn to sew like her mother, and Eliza began teaching her the basics of stitching and pattern making. Thomas's health began to decline when he was 45, his injured leg paining him more and more as arthritis set in. But he remained cheerful and active, doting on his nephew and niece, and continuing to manage the ranch's business affairs with his usual competence. When Matthew was 12 and Sarah was 9, James approached Eliza with a proposal. "I have been thinking," he said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "We have been blessed with a good life here, better than either of us ever expected. Maybe it is time we gave something back." "What did you have in mind?" Eliza asked, intrigued. "There are a lot of families in this area struggling to make ends meet. Widows with children, folks who have had bad luck with their crops or their herds. What if we used some of the money from the boarding house and your dressmaking to help them? Set up a fund that people could borrow from when times are hard, pay back when they are able. Eliza felt a rush of love for her husband. Even after all these years, he could still surprise her with his kindness and generosity. "I think that is a wonderful idea," she said. "Let us do it." They established the fund through the church in Silver Springs, and word spread quickly. Over the next few years, they helped dozens of families through hard times, asking only that the money be repaid when possible so it could help others. Some families were able to pay back every penny. Others could only manage partial repayment, and a few were never able to pay anything back at all, but James and Eliza did not press them. The point was to help, not to profit. The community's gratitude was evident. Families who had been helped through the fund would show up at the ranch with gifts: fresh baked bread, a side of venison, vegetables from their gardens. Children who might otherwise have gone hungry because their parents had fallen on hard times grew up healthy and strong. Widows were able to keep their homes instead of losing them to creditors. "This is your real legacy," Thomas said one day, watching as James accepted a basket of eggs from a widow whose farm they had helped save. "Not the size of the ranch or the number of cattle, but the lives you have touched and improved." Eliza thought about that conversation often in the years that followed. She thought about legacy and what mattered, about the warmth that James had given her on that cold night so long ago, and how they had spent their lives since then trying to spread that warmth to others. When Matthew turned 18, he told his parents he wanted to stay on the ranch and work alongside his father. "I cannot imagine doing anything else," he said earnestly. "This land is in my blood. I want to help build it even bigger and stronger." James was obviously pleased, though he tried to hide it. "You are sure? You could go to university in San Francisco or Carson City, get an education, see more of the world. I am sure, Papa, this is where I belong." Sarah, on the other hand, announced at 16 that she wanted to open her own dressmaking shop in Silver Springs. "I love sewing, Mama, but I want to do it as a real business with a storefront and everything. I want to create beautiful things that make women feel special." Eliza helped Sarah plan the business, drawing on her own years of experience. James and Thomas provided the capital to lease a small building in town and stock it with supplies. On the day Sarah's shop opened, the entire family was there to celebrate, along with half the town. "I am so proud of you," Eliza told her daughter, tears in her eyes as she looked around the cheerful shop with its bolts of fabric and displays of ready-made items. "I learned from the best," Sarah said, hugging her mother tightly. "Everything I know about sewing and running a business, I learned from watching you." Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 52, 10 years after his arthritis had begun troubling him. The family mourned him deeply, but they took comfort in knowing he had lived to see Matthew take his place as a full partner in the ranch and Sarah establish her successful business. His funeral was attended by over 100 people, testament to how beloved he had been in the community. James grieved his brother's loss keenly. "We were together our whole lives," he told Eliza one night as they lay in bed. "I do not know how to be in this house without him." "You carry him with you," Eliza said gently, taking his hand. "In your memories, in the way you run the ranch, in the values you have passed on to our children. Thomas is not gone, James. He is just in a different place now." With Thomas's passing, Matthew took over the business side of the ranch, proving himself to be as capable with ledgers and accounts as his uncle had been. The ranch continued to prosper under the joint management of father and son. When Sarah turned 22, she fell in love with a schoolteacher named David Morrison who had moved to Silver Springs from Denver. He was a kind, educated man who shared Sarah's love of learning and her desire to make the world better. James approved of the match, though he joked that he was not sure he was ready to give up his little girl. "She will always be your little girl, Papa," Sarah assured him. "Marriage will not change that." The wedding was held at the ranch, a joyous celebration that brought together family and friends from all over the territory. Eliza watched Sarah exchange vows with David and remembered her own wedding day, how nervous and excited she had been, how certain that marrying James was the right decision despite how quickly it was happening. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, as if reading her mind. "Our wedding day. How young we were, how in love, how we still are." "Always," James said, taking her hand. "Until the end of time, Eliza." 2 years after Sarah's wedding, Matthew married a rancher's daughter named Rebecca. She was a strong, practical woman who had grown up on the land and understood the demands of ranch life. Matthew built a house for them on the far side of the ranch property, close enough to the main house that they could work together, but far enough to give the young couple their privacy. "I am going to be a grandfather," James said in wonder when Rebecca announced her first pregnancy 9 months after the wedding. "How did I get old enough to be a grandfather?" "You are not old," Eliza said, though she knew what he meant. Where had the years gone? It seemed like just yesterday that James had found her freezing on the side of the road. And yet here they were, in their 40s now, with grown children and grandchildren on the way. Matthew and Rebecca's son was born in the spring of 1897, 16 years after Eliza and James had married. They named him James Thomas Carver, after his grandfather and great-uncle, and the elder James cried unashamedly when he held his grandson for the first time. "Welcome to the family, little James," he said softly. "You have got a lot to live up to with that name, but I know you will do us proud." Sarah and David had children as well, twin girls born in 1898. The girls spent summers at the ranch, running wild through the pastures and learning to ride just as their mother had done. The ranch house that had once been quiet, except for the sounds of 2 bachelor brothers, now rang constantly with the laughter and chaos of multiple generations. Eliza's dressmaking business had slowed over the years as her eyesight began to fail, but she still took special orders for valued customers and spent time teaching her granddaughters the basics of sewing. She found joy in passing down the skills that had sustained her through so many hard years, that had given her purpose and independence. On a cold January night in 1901, exactly 20 years after the night James had found her on the road, Eliza woke to find her husband watching her in the lamplight. "What is wrong?" she asked, immediately concerned. "Nothing is wrong. I was just thinking about this date, January 15th. 20 years ago tonight, I found you freezing on the side of the road." Eliza smiled and reached for his hand. "The best night of my life, though I did not know it at the time. Mine too. I have been lying here thinking about that blanket I gave you, the one lined with rabbit fur." "Do you remember it?" "Of course I remember. It saved my life." "I still have it," James said, "packed away in the trunk in the attic. I kept it all these years because it reminds me of that night, of finding you, of knowing the moment I wrapped it around you that something important was happening even if I did not understand what yet." "You wrapped warmth around me that night," Eliza said softly. "Not just physical warmth, though that blanket did save my life, but you wrapped your kindness and care around me, and you have been doing it ever since. Every single day for 20 years, you have given me warmth and love and security." "And you gave me the same," James said. "You gave me the warmest feeling I have ever known, Eliza. The feeling of being truly, completely loved. The feeling of having a partner and a home and a family. You gave me everything that matters." They lay together in the darkness, hands clasped, hearts beating in sync after 20 years of marriage. Outside, the Nevada winter wind howled around the house, but inside it was warm and safe, filled with love and memories and the promise of more years to come. "I would do it all again," Eliza whispered. "Every moment, every choice, every hard day and happy one, I would do it all exactly the same if it meant ending up here with you." "Me too," James said. "I would ride that road 1,000 times in the freezing cold if it meant finding you again and again." They renewed their vows on their 20th anniversary, a small ceremony attended by family and close friends. Matthew and Rebecca were there with their 3 children by then. Sarah and David brought their twins and their new baby son. The church in Silver Springs was packed with people whose lives had been touched by James and Eliza over the years, people who had been helped through hard times by the fund they had established, women who wore dresses Eliza had made, ranchers who had worked with James or sought his advice. Reverend Thompson, now elderly but still sharp as ever, performed the ceremony. 20 years ago, I married this couple on very short acquaintance, he said to the assembled crowd. Some people thought they were crazy, rushing into marriage after knowing each other barely 2 weeks. But I saw something in their faces that day, a connection that could not be denied or explained by logic. And look at what they have built together in these 20 years. A family, a successful ranch, a business, and a legacy of kindness and generosity that has touched countless lives. Let their marriage be an example to us all of what love can accomplish when 2 people are truly committed to each other. After the ceremony, there was a celebration at the ranch that lasted long into the night. Music and dancing and food and laughter filled the house and spilled out into the yard. James and Eliza danced together under the stars, moving slowly to the music, content just to be in each other's arms. "Happy anniversary, my love," James said, pressing a kiss to Eliza's forehead. "Happy anniversary. Here is to 20 more years. And 20 more after that if we are lucky." They were lucky. They had been lucky from the start, lucky in the timing that had brought them together on that cold winter night, lucky in the love they had found, lucky in the life they had built. The years continued to pass, bringing new challenges and joys. The ranch adapted to changing times, bringing in new breeding stock and implementing modern ranching techniques that Matthew learned about through correspondence with agricultural colleges. Sarah's dress shop expanded to a second location in Carson City, and she hired several seamstresses to help meet demand. The grandchildren grew and thrived, and eventually great-grandchildren began arriving. Through it all, James and Eliza remained the steady center of the family, their love for each other a constant that everyone could depend on. They had their disagreements, of course, their moments of frustration or misunderstanding. But they never went to bed angry, never let a day pass without expressing their love, never forgot the miracle of having found each other against all odds. On James's 65th birthday, the family threw him a large party. Eliza, now 63, stood beside him as he blew out the candles on his cake, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. "I am a rich man," James announced to the assembled crowd. "Not because of the ranch or the cattle or any material thing. I am rich because of the love in this room, because of the family we have created, because 44 years ago I had the good sense to give a freezing woman my blanket and then fall completely in love with her." Everyone laughed and applauded. Eliza felt tears prick her eyes as she looked around at all the faces, all the lives that existed because of that one cold night. Later, when the party was winding down and most of the guests had left, Eliza and James walked out to the porch to watch the sunset. The desert was painted in shades of gold and orange, beautiful and harsh and home. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had been different?" Eliza asked. "If your horse had thrown me on a different night, or if you had stayed in Silver Springs, or if you had just ridden past me in the dark?" "Never," James said firmly, "because those things did not happen. What happened was that I found you and I saved you and you saved me right back. What happened was the best thing that ever could have happened. Everything else is just speculation." "You are right," Eliza agreed. She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him beside her. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be. We both are." They stood together as the sun sank below the horizon, and the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. The same stars that had looked down on them that cold January night 44 years ago, bearing witness to the moment when 2 lives had intersected and changed forever. When James passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, Eliza thought her heart would break from the grief. They had been together for 52 years, more than half a century of partnership and love. She did not know how to exist in a world where he was not beside her. But she had the ranch, and she had her family, and she had a lifetime of memories to sustain her. Matthew and Rebecca moved into the main house to care for her, and her grandchildren and great-grandchildren visited frequently, filling the rooms with life and noise and love. On quiet evenings, Eliza would sit on the porch in her rocking chair, wrapped in the blanket that James had given her that first night. She had retrieved it from the attic after his death, needing to feel close to him, needing to remember. The blanket was old and worn now, the rabbit fur lining thin in places, but it was still warm. Still a reminder of the moment everything had changed. "Tell us the story again, great-grandma," the children would beg, clustering around her chair. "Tell us about the night great-grandpa found you." And Eliza would tell them, her voice soft but clear, about the cold desert night and the injured ankle and the certainty that she was going to die. About the sound of hoofbeats and the tall cowboy who had appeared out of the darkness. About the coat and the blanket and the warmth that had saved her life. "But the blanket did not just warm my body," Eliza would always say, reaching the end of the story. "It warmed my whole life. Your great-grandfather gave me warmth that night, and he kept giving it to me every day for 52 years. And I tried to give him the same. That is what love is, children. It is giving warmth to another person's life, day after day, year after year, until you have built something beautiful together." The children would nod solemnly, not fully understanding but sensing the importance of her words. And Eliza would smile and pull the old blanket tighter around her shoulders, feeling James's presence in its worn fabric, in the memories it held. She lived to be 87 years old, long enough to see her great-great-grandchildren born, long enough to know that the legacy she and James had built would continue for generations. When she finally passed away on a warm summer evening, surrounded by family, her last words were, "Thank you for the blanket, my love. Thank you for the warmth." They buried her next to James on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a sky so blue and vast it seemed to stretch into eternity. The entire community turned out for the funeral. 4 generations of family and countless friends whose lives had been touched by Eliza and James's love and generosity. Matthew, now in his 70s himself, stood at his mother's grave and spoke to the assembled crowd. "My mother used to say that love was about giving warmth to another person's life. She and my father did that for each other, and they did it for all of us. They taught us by example what it means to truly love someone, to build a life together, to create something that lasts beyond your own lifetime. This ranch, this family, the businesses they helped establish, the community fund that has helped so many people over the years, all of it exists because one cold January night, a cowboy gave a freezing woman his blanket. And in return, she gave him the warmest feeling known to humanity, the feeling of being truly, deeply, unconditionally loved." The crowd was silent except for the sound of quiet weeping. Then, one by one, people began to place flowers on Eliza's grave. By the time everyone had filed past, the grave was covered in blossoms, a riot of color against the desert landscape. Years later, Sarah's great-granddaughter would find the old blanket packed away in a trunk in the ranch house attic. It was fragile with age, the fabric thin and worn, the rabbit fur lining nearly gone, but something about it spoke to her, some sense of history and importance. "What is this?" she asked her grandmother, Sarah's granddaughter, who was visiting that day. The older woman smiled and took the blanket carefully in her hands. "This is where it all began," she said. "This blanket, on a cold January night in 1881, this is the blanket that saved your great-great-great-grandmother's life. The blanket that your great-great-great-grandfather gave her the night they met. This is the blanket that started everything, our family, this ranch, all of it." The young woman touched the worn fabric reverently. "Can you tell me the story?" "I can." Sit down, and I will tell you about a cowboy who gave a woman the warmest blanket on the coldest night, and how she gave him the warmest feeling known in return. I will tell you about love and legacy, and the way a single act of kindness can echo through generations. And so the story was passed down, as love stories should be, from one generation to the next. The ranch continued to prosper under the management of James and Eliza's descendants. Sarah's dress shop became a successful chain throughout Nevada. The community fund they had established grew and expanded, helping thousands of families over the decades. But more than any of those tangible legacies, what endured was the memory of their love. The story of the cowboy and the woman he had saved, and how they had spent 52 years showing each other and everyone around them what true love looked like. How they had taken that initial spark of warmth from a blanket on a cold night and nurtured it into a fire that burned bright enough to light the way for generations to come. The old ranch house still stands on the Nevada high desert, weathered by time but strong, maintained lovingly by each new generation of carvers. And if you visit on a cold January night when the wind howls across the open land and the stars shine brilliant and cold overhead, some people say you can almost see them. A tall cowboy on a bay horse, stopping to help a woman in distress, wrapping his coat and blanket around her, beginning a love story that would span 52 years and echo through time. Because that is what real love does. It warms not just two hearts, but everyone it touches. It creates ripples that spread outward in ways we cannot always see or measure. And it endures, long after the people who created it are gone, living on in the memories and stories and lives of those who come after. James gave Eliza his warmest blanket on the coldest night. And Eliza gave James the warmest feeling known, the deep, abiding, transformative love that two souls feel when they recognize each other as home. Together, they built a life and a legacy that proved love is not just an emotion or a fleeting feeling, but a force powerful enough to change the world, one warm blanket at a time.